Last week I heard that a third of young American men hadn't had any sex in the last year. It's one of those social statistics that does the rounds now and then and can be hard to know what to do with. But a quick dig reveals that this isn't simply data that's been cherry-picked for clickbait. It really does seem that young men are having less sex than the cohorts of young men before them. It's not just a bit either, far less. One major longitudinal study of Americans has the rate of men who have zero sex in a given year going from 7% in 1989 to 27% just 3 decades later. Getting an exact picture of the trend is difficult, given that there are so many factors that make it difficult to measure sexual activity across different societies and times, not least being the changing conceptions of sexuality, gender, and what constitutes sex itself. But while the specifics can be thorny to disaggregate, the trend appears to be the same. Across the liberal world, people of all ages are generally having less and less sex. And of all the groups who are having less sex, by the numbers, it's young people that stand out the most. And of them, young men stand out further still. The causes and consequences of social phenomena are, for mine, always too complex to pretend to understand exhaustively. But that doesn't mean it isn't interesting to explore, and more than worth taking a second look at why today's young people, and young men in particular, appear to be having much less sex than their ancestors. When I raised this phenomenon with a married friend, he was really surprised. If this universal decline in sex is also news to you, I can see why, and I think you can be forgiven for not expecting it. Sex mostly happens in private, and given that so many traditional barriers to sexuality have been removed, it's easy to assume that people are doing it more than ever. After all, extramarital sex has gone from a taboo to a norm. Contraceptive technologies have decoupled male-female intercourse from reproduction, which radically lowers the consequences of sex and makes it much easier to pursue purely for pleasure. Dating apps have removed some of the harder parts of finding a sexual partner. They mostly decouple the act of expressing your interest in someone from the pain of rejection, and so they can also speed up courtship by guaranteeing some baseline of mutual interest before you're even able to start a conversation with someone. And our culture is, in a way, just far more sexualized than the very recent past. TV shows that form the center of the mainstream, like Euphoria, Game of Thrones, and Normal People, depict levels of nudity, types of sexual acts, and styles of relationships that wouldn't have been publicly seen at any level in the very recent past. For perspective, Elvis Presley, who's close enough to the present to remain a household name, had to be filmed from the waist up when he was on the Ed Sullivan Show so that audiences wouldn't have to be confronted by the provocation of his gyrating hips. It wasn't until the year that I was born that anyone said the word period on TV at all. When I was at school, Seinfeld could only allude to the word clitoris, even though it was the punchline of an entire storyline. Dolores! Today, the mainstream's obviously far less shy.
Yeah, you fucking with some wet ass pussy. Bring a bucket and a mop for this
wet ass P-word.
There's also been a relative decline of the church, family, and state as regulators of permissible sexual practices. They're still present, but the transition has been huge. Again, in the space of mere decades, liberal society has led homosexual sex from being a codified mental illness and a punishable crime to something that's actively approved of by most major churches. This change is enormous. Aliens watching from the outside in could well be forgiven for assuming that humanity had suddenly entered an age in which sex had gone from an unspoken taboo to a routinely enjoyed pastime. But what's fascinating, or at least to me, is that the correlation appears to be the exact opposite, because the numbers are clear, and they're increasingly stark. A recent survey in Japan had 33% of people between 18 and 34 having never had sex at all. So there's evidently more to the story, but what exactly? What's the cause of our growing sexlessness? There are a number of candidates. After all, it's been a time of significant social acceleration in more ways than I think we realise day to day. We have a sudden access to everyone and everything at all times in a way that's totally new. The upheaval of our social norms that's come with this is impossible to quantify from such a close distance. But I think anyone would predict that this would swing a hammer to our lives and culture in any number of ways. The first and maybe most obvious one to look at is access to porn. At the time that I was born, if you wanted to access some good masturbating stimuli, you had to look at the underpants section of the Kmart mail out, or go all the way to a service station and shamefully pick out a magazine that you couldn't even browse through before buying. Now, if you're watching this video, you're within a couple of clicks of consuming basically whatever hyper-specific sexual niche that excites you most. Which, I guess like everything, is good and bad. It's certainly convenient, and not unlike sex itself, can be super addictive, and it's changing the sexual appetites of its users. Of the most viewed of all-time videos on Pornhub, more than half involve incest fantasies, which growing up I just wouldn't have guessed was something that would become popular at all, outside of very niche circles. So the sudden and massive proliferation of regular porn use has had many studied impacts. So as always, rather than good or bad, it's complex. but certainly impactful. Suddenly being able to access instantly, perfectly fulfilling, or for many I'm sure superior forms of sexual pleasure is such a powerful wildcard to throw alongside the sexual urges that our body and courtship cultures have evolved for. Even if you, like many, don't find porn as fulfilling a sexual experience as sex with another person, accessing porn today takes a lot less time and cognitive energy than even just standing up and brushing the crumbs off your shirt. Compared to the energy and well-being risks involved in navigating the complexities of a human relationship, you can see why more than 60% of women and more than 90% of men reported using porn in the last month. But it doesn't end at its use, and there's plenty of evidence that the prevalence of porn impacts sexual experiences with real-life partners as well. This phenomenon is always going to have an outlier impact for young people who have been the first generations to have this easy access dominate the mix of their formative sexual experiences. And while it's worth remembering that we're absolutely not living in an Eden of flawless sexual exchange before, the wrecking ball of internet porn has its own flavour of impact that's worth reflecting upon because porn use is a distinct experience of sex. Most obviously, it can supplant sex, but porn is not sex. It is in fact very often hyper-stylized examples of sexual activity. And where it supplants formative sexual experiences, it can be easy to assume that it's modelling routine sexual behaviours, which can lead to people developing totally unrealistic expectations of sexual partners. Even moderate use of porn can condition sexual arousal in a manner that's disconnected from the interpersonal encounters that lead to real-life sexual relationships. This is thought to be behind the massively growing number of otherwise physically capable young men who find themselves unable to achieve erections in sexual encounters. The marketplaces of porn see them in the same algorithmic competition for attention that's seen an escalating arms race of increasingly stark content leading to desensitization. As mentioned, that can distort people's perceptions of the more outlier sex acts and interests as being commonplace, which leads to lowered personal confidence often and less embodied or respectful in-person encounters sometimes. This can really cloud the journey of learning how to find, discern, and share enjoyable sexual experiences, and can stunt the development of the associated skills. There are any number of factors influencing sexual development, and we're still in the relatively early days of ubiquitous porn. I personally don't think that internet porn alone is responsible for the decline in sex. After all, a happy meal is an easy source of salt, fat, and carbohydrates that takes none of the work of preparing a meal and is super cheap. But very few of us choose to eat nothing but happy meals. It certainly can't be helping, but there are other factors to look at. Contemporary life seems to be having a significant effect on average people's physiognomy. Our bodies are different to those of even our recent ancestors, and this is due to some mix of changes to our lifestyles, environments, and our chemical intake. Men's testosterone is one area where the change has been significant. Different studies give different specifics, but it appears that the testosterone level of the average man has been declining around 1% per year for many decades now. The cumulative effect of this decline is that the average 22-year-old man today has a testosterone level similar to that a 67-year-old man would have had in the year 2000. As an indicator of how this might impact the rates of sexual activity, take a look at the symptoms that a doctor checks for when determining if someone should be worried about low testosterone. Low sex drive, chronic fatigue, and erectile dysfunction. Hardly the desired ingredients for a flourishing sex life. They seem to be such mood killers that you could imagine blaming low testosterone for the reduced sexuality of young men all by itself, but it's still too complex to isolate the blame. And given that having sex increases testosterone and not having sex for long periods decreases it, how can we be sure if low testosterone levels are the consequence or the cause of reduced sexual activity here? I can't imagine that people's sex lives aren't being impacted by the historically recent instant access we have to endlessly occupying stimuli of all kinds. Algorithmically addictive social media and other media is extraordinarily low cost to access, and by design drives an endless appetite so that whatever your particular poison is, it's not only closer than ever before, but probably actively calling out to you on the numerous devices you have within arm's reach of you right now. And I think there's a strong case that this is a big culprit, because while the sexless trend is most notable in young men, the percentage of people having sex is in decline across every single demographic. There isn't space to properly unpack it here, but the hijacking of our cognitive faculties and dopamine systems at this scale is certainly something new, and given how many of us start and end the day looking at our phones, it seems logical enough that this would hit our ability to be present in the places of relaxation, connection, and even just boredom that might otherwise become the sites of our sexual pursuits. We spend less time wandering around looking for fun and more time being idly entertained than ever before. When I told my sister I was making this video, she straight away said I should talk about video games and showed me these pictures of rooms of gaming addicts, asserting that these people could absolutely not be having sex. You also might have seen the advent of AI partners now. These typically come in the form of freemium model apps, where you've got a customizable friend that learns about your interests, demonstrates care for you around them, flirts with you, and, for a paid subscription, will engage with you sexually. I don't have any data, but based on a quick Reddit scouring, these apps seem to be mostly used by young men, whom I found posting story after story delighting in the emotional and sexual connection that they're sharing with their chatbots. It's hard to imagine that this isn't one-to-one supplanting the sexual relationships they might otherwise be forging. Given that these are mostly early adopters and that the technology has so far to come yet, it'll be interesting to see how far this tech impacts the sexual development of young people in the very near future. You don't have to leave the house to get food, you don't have to leave the couch to be entertained, and you don't have to stand up to connect with someone. And you can get apparently perfectly captivating hits of intimate connection without even turning your head from wherever you are right now. These things have become so familiar that it's weird to think that this capacity didn't exist for the thousands of generations of people that came before us. Whether this change to intimate human interrelations is caused by being busy, or we're busying ourselves because we're lonely, the structure of relationships in our society has changed massively. 30% of US adults are single, but it's 47% for those under 30. People are having kids less and less and later, and the percentage of single people who are not looking for a partner at all is up to 50%. Just a reminder, I'm not saying that this is good or bad, it's inevitably both for different people, but it's definitely interesting and I think it's worth trying to understand. People are also getting married at lower rates, and those who do get married much later in life. It's another one that might seem counterintuitive, but people who are married as a cohort have more sex than people who aren't. I mean, your husband or wife is likely already there in bed with you. It's much easier than risking a boring dinner conversation with someone untested through an app. As the traditional courtship methods have been obliterated, they've eradicated the better-known paths to sexual connection as well. This is for sure a good thing for those many people in all cultures who have been disempowered and disrespected through types of courtships based on entitlement and rite of passage. But the new landscape also requires a high degree of skill to successfully navigate. What is or isn't acceptable behaviour is still a very contested space, and would understandably induce anxiety and confusion in young people who are at the point of developing those skills for the first time, especially given the lack of modelling. I didn't learn anything at all about courtship or intimate relationships from my parents, and picked up surprisingly little from my peers. It has been, and continues to be, a path of trying, failing, and recalibrating. But it's easier when you can skip some lessons thanks to the mistakes of others. Much easier. But the current conditions are probably more alien than ever, and I can only imagine for people younger than me that it's even more difficult to relate across the generations. After all, I'm only in my late 30s, but I didn't have a phone until I was 17. I remember girls coming up to me in school to tell me that one of their friends liked me. I remember being bored sitting at home and going out on my own to find any place where other people would be, and then swallowing my shyness to talk to strangers that I thought looked interesting. These are experiences that are sliding down the list of how people connect. It'll be more than a decade until I'm giving relationship and sex advice to my own son. How completely out of date will my own experiences be by then? Decades on from the sexual revolution, we're experiencing other upheavals in our collective narratives on sexuality, gender, consent, respect for relationships, and so much more. I think it's fair to say that the currents young people are navigating and forging sexual relationships have grown in complexity. I mentioned earlier that dating apps remove a lot of the uncertainty of in-person courtship because you already know that you like each other. They also massively reduce the time you might have to spend to find someone and arrange to meet. So you'd think that this would lead to way more sexual encounters. And for some, it absolutely does. But the experience is not universal, and I think there's a fair case to be made that on the whole, dating apps reduce sexual activity. As anyone who's used them knows, connecting and communicating without the accountability markers of in-person or in-community situations can be a pretty degrading experience, especially for women. They're also increasingly colonising the culture of how people meet each other. A 2019 Stanford study found that dating apps have taken the lead for the first time to become the most common way that American couples meet, mostly displacing people being introduced by friends or family. I can imagine that any one of these factors wouldn't need to be too strong to have a significant impact that becomes a vicious cycle, wherein sex being slightly less rewarding to have or slightly more complicated to navigate makes people pursue it a lot less and changes the shape of its culture as a result. And it's important to say that sex itself can't be meaningfully measured by its frequency alone. It's perfectly possible to have lots of sex that isn't enjoyable, or to have occasional sex that you enjoy spectacularly. If someone told me I could read one great book a year or 50 bad ones, it would be a no-brainer. But I think there's still cause to be concerned about this development, mainly because it seems to be accompanied by other cultural trends that I think indicate frustration and sadness from our less sexed young people. From the toxically entitled incel movements and growing audience for feckless braggarts like Andrew Tate, to the near ubiquitous complaining about men that you'll hear from any woman who's trying to find a date, it doesn't seem like everyone is just happily swapping sex for NPC streaming.
Per, amazing.
Which ultimately seems sad to me, but I'd love to hear from everyone else on this. Whether you're hoping to have more sex in your life, or feel alienated in your choice to deprioritize sex with others. I hope that it's of some comfort to see that you're not alone in this experience, and despite the representations of sex in the public culture, it's something that the collective is spending less and less time doing. I think, as always, it's best just to be having dialogues about the big things that are happening in our society, so that we can work together to navigate life's difficulties and help to make it as rewarding as it can be for each other. And if you've struggled with sex and blamed yourself, I hope that you can see how much there is in the contemporary landscape that's totally new in making it more difficult for everyone. Hopefully for some of you, there are small barriers that, now that they're defined, won't seem so difficult to overcome. Because for those who want to be connecting to others, you don't need the stats to know the health and well-being benefits. Being lonely gives the equivalent health hit of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Everyone's different, of course, but I think for most people, the experience of having intimate relationships in life offers benefits that are beyond compare. And that's all despite being among the hardest things that any of us will ever do. I hope you enjoyed taking a second look at this, and thanks so much for joining me, with special thanks to my patrons. My poor, long-suffering patrons. If you found this interesting, please do consider sharing it. And if you want to help me out, a like and a subscribe goes a long way. But of course, joining my Patreon goes even further. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you next time.